The room reeked of jasmine, sweat, and blood. A young girl, barely 5 years old, sat trembling on a low wooden stool. Her mother crouched beside her, whispering songs that couldn't mask the sound of bones snapping beneath cloth. One by one, her tiny toes were folded backward, crushed against the sole of her foot until they broke clean in two. Blood soaked the wrappings. Her cries were muffled by a silk handkerchief shoved into her mouth. And when it was over, the girl couldn't walk, but the adults in the room were smiling. She had taken her first step toward beauty. This was not a punishment. This was tradition. In ancient China, elegance was forged in agony, and the most celebrated beauty often bled in silence. Behind every powdered face, every fragrant sleeve was a story of endurance, submission, and pain. These were not isolated practices or strange one-offs. They were rituals woven into the fabric of daily life, passed from mother to daughter like heirlooms, and they were brutal. The desire to be beautiful wasn't born in a mirror. It was imposed from above, carved by dynasty, dictated by custom, and cemented by Confucian expectations. A woman's worth was measured by how pleasing she appeared to others, particularly to men. It didn't matter what it cost her. It didn't matter what it broke inside her. If she looked delicate, obedient, pale, and ethereal, she had done her duty. In the Forbidden City, in noble households, and even in modest villages, beauty wasn't about expression. It was about survival. The deeper you go into the rituals of Chinese beauty, the more unsettling it becomes. These weren't just treatments. They were ordeals, feats of endurance, acts of devotion disguised as cosmetics. Women were painted with poison. Their bodies were sliced, broken, and burned, all in the pursuit of an impossible ideal, whispered through generations: be soft, be small, be pure. Be beautiful even if it kills you. Behind every elaborate hairstyle was a neck that had learned not to move. Behind every pale face was a liver dying from mercury. Behind every graceful step was a foot deformed beyond recognition. The more desirable a woman appeared, the more likely it was that her beauty had been built on scars. This isn't the history taught in classrooms or painted in serene museum portraits. This is the history buried beneath silk and silence. The shadow of beauty, where powder conceals pain, where perfume masks decay, and where the price of a single compliment could be years of agony. The imperial courts were especially ruthless. Women were handpicked to serve the emperor not just for their charm or wit, but for their flawless skin, dainty feet, and perfectly shaped brows. A single blemish could mean banishment, a wrinkle irrelevance. Aging was a kind of death, and so girls began their transformations early. Before they could even read, they learned the rituals that would govern the rest of their lives. Every noble family knew the unspoken rules. Your daughter had to be presentable by 6. She had to begin whitening her skin by 10. She had to learn to smile through hunger and silence her screams during binding. Her body wasn't hers. It was an offering to husbands, to fathers, to emperors, to ancestors. Some believed these rituals were empowering, a way for women to gain influence in a world that denied them voice. But when influence requires pain, is it power or just another prison? Not all women suffered quietly. There were whispers of concubines who poisoned rivals of courtesans, who used their beauty to manipulate kings of widows who scarred themselves so no man would ever want them again. But even in rebellion, the body remained the battlefield. The real horror is not just in what was done, but in how normal it was. No one questioned it. No one blinked when a child was wrapped in cloth until her bones cracked. No one stopped a woman from applying powders that made her teeth fall out. Pain was tradition. Pain was pride. Pain was beautiful. And beauty was never kind. So what were these treatments that turned flesh into fashion? What poisons were passed off as face powder? What rituals were performed by moonlight in the privacy of tear-stained rooms? Across the next chapters, we will expose 5 of the most horrifying beauty practices women endured in ancient China, each one more disturbing than the last. But before we begin, ask yourself, if beauty demanded blood, how much would you give? She was 4 years old when they took her shoes away. They said it was time. Time to become a proper woman. Time to be worthy of love, of marriage, of status. Time to break. The child was led into a candlelit room where her grandmother sat with strips of white cloth soaked in herbs and water ready to twist her future into shape. The girl didn't know yet that this was the last day she would ever run. Footbinding chanzu, or wrapping the feet, was a practice so grotesque, so physically violating, that it reads today like something out of a nightmare. And yet for nearly 1,000 years it was a defining mark of femininity in China. For many families, a daughter with unbound feet was unthinkable. Better she go blind or mute than grow up with big feet. Large feet meant poverty. Large feet meant shame. The process began early before the arches had fully developed. The goal: create the golden lotus, a foot no longer than 3 inches, the perfect symbol of fragility and obedience. To achieve this, the toes were curled under and pressed into the sole until the bones snapped. Then the arch was broken, forcefully pushing the heel and toes together into a twisted crescent. The foot was bound tightly in cotton cloth and rewrapped every day to force it into a smaller shape, tighter and tighter no matter how much blood spilled. The pain wasn't temporary. It was constant. Girls often screamed until they lost consciousness. Some vomited. Others passed out from the fever that followed. If the wrappings weren't tight enough, the shape wouldn't hold. If they were too tight, the flesh would die. Either way, the girl would walk with agony for the rest of her life. It didn't matter if she bled. It didn't matter if her toes turned black or her nails rotted off. In fact, that was expected. Infections were so common that they had their own rhyme. To bleed is to grow, to rot is to bloom. Mothers would check the bindings daily for pus and necrosis, and if the skin began to peel, they'd smile. That meant progress. There are records of mothers celebrating when maggots appeared inside the bandages. Why? Because maggots ate the dead flesh, keeping infection at bay. A natural form of wound debridement, disgusting yet oddly effective. They eat what we don't need. One mother wrote in a surviving household manual, they protect her future. And what a future it was. Bound feet weren't just a sign of beauty, they were a marriage ticket. Men fetishized the tiny shoes sometimes more than the feet themselves. The erotic mystery of a woman hobbling, tiptoeing, unable to walk without assistance, became a symbol of control, of power. A bound-foot woman couldn't run, couldn't work in the fields, couldn't climb to escape. She was the perfect wife, immobile, dependent, and permanently delicate. Shoes became miniature works of art. Embroidered with dragons, phoenixes, and flowers, they looked like toys no longer than a thumb. But what they hid was monstrous. Inside those shoes were feet twisted into claw-like shapes, toes fused beneath the sole, bones that never healed, scars that reopened every day. Many women developed lifelong infections or lost toes entirely. Some died from gangrene before their 10th birthday. And yet bound feet were passed down like pride. Mothers who had endured the pain themselves saw it not as cruelty but duty. They believed they were helping their daughters find security, love, and social standing. The worse the pain, the greater the sacrifice. And sacrifice in the eyes of tradition was sacred. There are stories, quiet, chilling ones, of little girls crying themselves to sleep, then waking up to find their mother had retightened the bindings during the night. Even in dreams, the shaping never stopped. Wives with bound feet rarely left the home. Some were carried. Others shuffled painfully, step by step. Their calves withered from disuse. Their hips twisted over time, creating the signature swaying gait that men found so enchanting. But they were in constant discomfort. Every step a reminder, every movement a scar. This wasn't a short-lived fad. It spanned dynasties: Song, Ming, Qing. Even as late as the 20th century, elderly women in rural provinces still wore their lotus shoes with pride. They no longer remembered the pain, only the reward, the compliments, the status, the admiration, the lie. And perhaps that's the most horrifying truth of all: pain over time becomes legacy. Beauty, however brutal, becomes memory. The body forgets, the culture remembers, and the cycle continues. So the next time you see a graceful image of a Chinese woman from centuries past, painted delicately in a scroll, or frozen in a black and white photograph, look at her shoes. Think about what they hid. Think about the child who screamed for hours while her family smiled. Think about the elegance built on shattered bones, because for hundreds of years to be beautiful meant to be broken. But even crushed feet were only the beginning. If beauty could be carved into the body, what happened when it was painted on the face? She stares into the bronze mirror, its surface dimmed by candlelight and steam. A trembling hand dips into a delicate porcelain jar, scooping out a pale velvety powder. She applies it carefully to her face, covering the bruises beneath her eyes, the yellowing of her teeth, the grayness creeping into her lips. The powder is laced with lead. She knows this. Her gums have bled for weeks. Her hair falls out in clumps each morning. But what choice does she have? In the court of the emperor, no one sees sickness, they see skin. And hers must be flawless. White skin was not just fashionable in ancient China, it was a form of spiritual currency symbolizing wealth, purity, and divine favor. A pale complexion meant you didn't toil in the sun like peasants. It meant you were worthy of admiration, marriage, and inheritance. And so generations of women poisoned themselves, slowly, religiously, with deadly face powders in the desperate pursuit of being white enough. The most infamous of these was known as Bai Lian San, or white lotus powder. It was a finely milled cosmetic blend, often containing lead carbonate mercury sulfide, and even traces of arsenic mixed with crushed pearls, animal fats, and herbal perfumes to mask the stench of rot. When applied, it gave the skin an ethereal porcelain glow. Under candlelight, a woman's face would shine like the moon, pale, unblemished, ghost-like. But beneath that glow, the body began to die. Lead absorbed through the skin entered the bloodstream, silently attacking the kidneys, liver, and central nervous system. Women experienced tremors, hallucinations, fatigue, and violent abdominal pain. Some miscarried again and again. Others went blind. Their faces, once radiant, cracked and blistered with ulcers, the skin peeling away in strips. And yet they reapplied the powder daily, sometimes several times a day. There was no such thing as too pale. The paler, the better. Women rubbed whitening agents into their necks, their hands, even their tongues. Some used ground pearl mixed with vinegar to bleach the skin. Others turned to virgin clay harvested from sacred earth beneath temples, believed to purify both body and soul. For courtesans and concubines, the pressure was even more extreme. Their beauty determined their fate. A concubine with fading color could be cast aside like a servant. An empress with blemishes could be replaced, humiliated, or even executed under accusations of dishonoring the court. In the Forbidden City, where appearances meant everything, a woman's face was her battlefield and the powder her armor. Many died with swollen faces and blackened gums, the result of years of daily exposure to mercury-laced rouges and arsenic-based concealers. Physicians of the time tried to warn them. Some even wrote public treatises condemning these ingredients. But their warnings were dismissed. Beauty had its price, and in a world where women's voices were silenced, pale skin was one of the few ways to speak. The cosmetic rituals were elaborate. Noblewomen spent hours layering powders, drawing veins with blue ink to simulate translucence, and blending cheek color using cinnabar, a mineral rich in mercury. Some applied honey mixed with ground lead at night, sealing it with silk to lock in the whiteness. They slept in poison, dreaming of acceptance. One haunting account tells of a young bride who collapsed on her wedding night. Her skin had turned cold and gray. When the maidservants removed her veil, they found her mouth filled with frothy blood, her face caked in thick layers of powder that had crusted into the skin. She had whitened herself to death, and still the powders kept selling. Recipes were passed down like family secrets. Mothers taught their daughters which blends would stick longer, which ones made the eyes glow. No one questioned the faint metallic taste in their mouths. No one spoke of the shaking hands or the memory lapses. These were just side effects of beauty, part of the transformation. The more a woman suffered, the more beautiful she was said to be. Pale faces became symbols not just of nobility, but of endurance. Women who bore the pain were admired for their devotion. Those who resisted were ridiculed, dismissed as coarse, unrefined. The message was clear: better to die lovely than to live ordinary. In time, skin whitening became ritualized beyond the elite. Merchant wives and rural girls mimicked the noble trend, creating homemade concoctions with ground bones, fermented rice water, and chalk. These versions were no safer. Many contained mold parasites or spoiled animal products. But the dream of pale skin was universal, a kind of salvation. And yet no one ever looked too closely. The pallor of sickness was mistaken for elegance. The smell of decay was hidden behind lotus perfume. The scars were covered, the stories left untold. Because in ancient China, the question was never, is this safe? It was always, is this beautiful enough? But what happens when the face becomes a mask and the mask starts to crack? What horrors wait behind the powder beneath the painted smile? She sat with her forehead bowed, candlelight flickering across the sharp blade in her hand. In front of her, a small bronze mirror reflected a ghostly image. Smooth, pale skin, red-dyed lips, and 2 black slashes above her eyes where eyebrows had once been. Slowly, deliberately, she dipped the blade into a bowl of vinegar and bile and pressed it against her scalp, just along the hairline. She winced as it seared. This was not just vanity. This was sacrifice. To whiten her forehead, she would burn the skin. It would scab. It would scar. And in time, it would mark her as beautiful. In the courts of ancient China, beauty didn't stop at skin tone. It extended to shape, especially of the face. And within the face, 3 things mattered above all: the forehead, the eyebrows, and the symmetry of suffering. The goal was to appear ethereal, untouched, celestial. But to achieve that, women disfigured themselves, often permanently. Let's begin with the brows. To us, eyebrows are cosmetic details, plucked, penciled, forgotten. But in dynastic China, they were a language of their own. Each era brought a new shape, a new symbolism. The Tang dynasty adored thick, crescent-shaped brows. In the Song dynasty, thin, arched lines were in vogue. Later came the willow leaf, the moth's wing, and the infamous plum blossom brow, where 2 dots replaced natural hair entirely. Natural eyebrows weren't acceptable. They were shaved, plucked out strand by strand until the skin was raw. Some women used thread soaked in lime and ash to rip them from the root. Others applied herbal pastes made with sulfur and vinegar that chemically burned the follicles into silence. And once the face was blank, the painting began. With brushes made from hair fur, women inked new eyebrows using soot, cinnabar charcoal, or even crushed silkworms. Shapes were copied from scrolls or dictated by court fashion. A woman who painted the wrong style might be laughed out of court, or worse, seen as trying to mimic a higher-ranking rival. The pressure to conform meant women sometimes tattooed their eyebrows permanently. They would sit motionless while an inked needle pricked their skin hundreds of times, drawing curves they would carry into death. The ink often contained poisonous compounds, mercury, lead, ash, which led to infections and swelling. But permanence was better than imperfection. Then there was the forehead. In imperial aesthetics, a high, wide forehead was a symbol of intelligence, nobility, and spiritual clarity. But few women were born with the desired shape. So they made one. To widen the forehead, hairlines were burned back using corrosive pastes made from vinegar, crushed garlic, and bat feces. The mixture was applied along the scalp until the skin blistered and peeled. Repeated often enough, the hair stopped growing. In some cases, skin became permanently discolored brown-purple, even black from chemical burns. These wounds were covered with layers of powder, but the damage festered beneath. Other women turned to razors, scraping away the hairline day after day, until baldness gave the illusion of an elevated brow. Some bound their foreheads with tight bands soaked in herb oil, believing this would train the skull to grow in the proper shape. There were even whispered practices where girls were pressed with hot combs, as infants, shaping their heads into fashionable silhouettes. Beauty here wasn't enhancement. It was warfare. A daily attack on one's own face in the hopes of looking fragile enough, wise enough, divine enough. And still, it went deeper. Some women dyed their foreheads with tinctures that turned the skin red or yellow colors seen as lucky, or elegant depending on the dynasty. Others pierced the skin with fine needles and rubbed in flower petals or gold dust, staining the face like sacred art. But none of this guaranteed safety. A woman who stood out too much, who shaped her brows too bold or painted her face too extravagantly, could be accused of seduction, witchcraft, or pride. In one famous case, a concubine was imprisoned for attempting to enchant the emperor with unnatural brows. Her face was scrubbed raw with pumice stone and salt water until no paint remained, and neither did her skin. Even outside the palace, young girls emulated the courtly trends using kitchen soot and garden thorns to mimic the high-born look. There are folk tales of peasants' daughters who scarred themselves copying the plum blossom brow, only to be ridiculed for pretending to be noble. Beauty, it seemed, was as dangerous to reach for as it was to lack. Imagine waking every day and staring into a mirror not to enhance yourself but to erase yourself. Erase your brows. Burn back your hairline. Scrape your face smooth. Then rebuild it with ash blood and ink until someone else, someone prettier, purer, worthier, stared back. These weren't enhancements. They were masks made of pain. And the longer you wore them, the less of your real face remained. But if destroying the face was this brutal, what did these women do to their lips, their eyes, their very breath to achieve perfection? The air in the dressing chamber was thick with perfume and something else, something metallic and faintly rotten. A noblewoman sat motionless as two maids hovered over her, brushing a thick red paste across her lips and cheeks. Her face was powdered white, her eyelids shimmering with crushed minerals, her lashes blackened with soot and goose fat. She looked perfect. Porcelain, almost inhuman. But behind the beauty, her body was failing. She coughed into a cloth stained with blood. Her gums ached, her fingertips trembled, and still she whispered, "More rouge." Imperial cosmetics in ancient China were far more than decoration. They were ritual, performance, weapon. Every morning was a ceremony of transformation, turning the vulnerable human face into something worthy of courtly admiration. But these powders, paints, and pastes were laced with deadly substances harvested from insects, minerals, animal parts, and poisons. Beauty was not a glow. It was a slow decay. Let's begin with the lips. The red that graced a noblewoman's mouth was often made from cinnabar, a brilliant pigment derived from mercury sulfide. Applied daily, it gave a luminous, almost supernatural shine, deep blood red, impossible to ignore. But cinnabar is one of the most toxic substances in the natural world. Prolonged exposure caused mercury poisoning, leading to trembling hallucinations, memory loss, and organ failure. Women often reapplied the pigment several times a day, especially when in the presence of higher-ranking men. The richer the color, the more desirable she appeared. And the more frequently she touched up, the more she absorbed the toxin through cracked lips, the inner mouth, and skin. Over time, the lips darkened unnaturally. Then the teeth blackened. Then the tongue grew numb. But cinnabar wasn't just used on the lips. It also colored the cheeks, the temples, even the breasts, any area a lover or emperor might see. In some formulations, the red pigment was mixed with pig's blood fermented in clay pots for weeks until it thickened into a paint-like sludge. It reeked of iron and decay, but once applied it gave the illusion of youth, health, and warmth. Women tolerated the smell because they had to. To add shine to the face, some used bird droppings, especially from nightingales believed to have skin-lightening enzymes. The droppings were dried ground and mixed with rice water to create a facial lacquer. The ammonia in the mixture stripped the skin of oil and bacteria, yes, but also removed its natural barrier, leaving it raw and vulnerable. Eye makeup was no kinder. Lining the eyes with kohl, a mixture of soot-powdered antimony and animal fat, was a common practice. It deepened the gaze, widened the eyes, and conveyed mystery. But antimony is another heavy metal slowly absorbed through the sensitive skin around the eyelids. Women sometimes enhanced their lashes by dipping them in mixtures of snake venom and ash, which caused the eyes to swell slightly and look glossier, more seductive. The venom burned, sometimes blinded, but those who withstood the pain were praised for their celestial eyes. Then there was huadian, the delicate forehead ornaments worn between the brows. At first, they were simple marks made from ink or gold foil shaped like flowers, birds, or flames. But over time, they evolved into paste-on appliques crafted from crushed beetles' gemstones or fish scales. The glue used to attach them often included ox bile and tree sap, which could cause allergic reactions or permanent discoloration. The preparation of these cosmetics was its own world of horror. Noble families employed special servants trained in the alchemy of beauty. These women, often slaves or concubines, handled poisonous ingredients daily with bare hands. Many died young, their lungs filled with toxic powders, their fingers eaten away by mercury burns. Their deaths were unrecorded, their work unthanked. Beauty recipes were closely guarded secrets. Passed between mothers and daughters, concubines and maids, they were whispered like spells. 3 parts pearl dust, 1 part pig fat, grind before sunrise, apply before sleep. Some formulas required ingredients so rare that they cost more than gold, like crushed kingfisher feathers, harvested by plucking the birds alive for maximum iridescence. In the imperial harem, cosmetics weren't just fashion, they were competition. The emperor might see a woman only once. That moment had to be unforgettable. So they painted themselves like living goddesses. Lips like rose petals, skin like snow, eyes like black glass. But every layer of paint was another veil between who they were and what they had to be. The pigments sank into their pores. The toxins made homes in their blood. They were dying slowly, beautifully, and it didn't stop. Even as their bodies betrayed them, vomiting blood, losing hair, hearing whispers that weren't real, they continued the ritual. Every morning. Every night. Because to stop meant losing favor, losing rank, losing everything. One tale tells of a courtesan who tried a new lipstick made from camphor poppy oil and mercury. She collapsed at a banquet, her mouth frothing, her body twitching on the lacquered floor. The other women simply looked away and reapplied their own, because if a woman dies while looking perfect, it's still considered a triumph. But not all pain was hidden behind rouge and perfume. Some forms of beauty demanded blood itself, taken from the most sacred source a woman possessed. The cup was small, no larger than a blossom's bud, yet it contained what alchemists whispered was the most potent elixir known to man, the blood of a virgin. Thick, dark, and still warm. It had been collected in secret during the girl's first bleeding, mixed with jade powder and deer antler, then sealed in a lacquered vessel. The emperor drank it slowly, ceremoniously. It was believed to restore youth, sharpen the mind, and invigorate the flesh. She was 14. She would never be the same. In the shadows of imperial palaces where beauty was more sacred than life, there emerged a horrifying convergence of mysticism, medicine, and misogyny, the use of menstrual blood as a tool of rejuvenation and aesthetic transformation. This was not fringe alchemy. This was doctrine. According to certain Taoist beliefs, menstrual blood, especially from virgins, was a vital essence, a concentrated life force known as Jing. It carried the potential of birth, of immortality, of divine balance. If consumed, it could fortify the body. If applied to the skin, it could preserve youth. If stolen, it could break the spirit. Women, especially young girls, became living vessels of this sacred substance. Their blood was not just monitored, it was harvested. Alchemists in the service of emperors and high-ranking nobles would visit harems and concubine quarters, seeking candidates with pure cycles. These girls were fed special diets to regulate their bleeding, isolated to avoid contamination, and forced to undergo ritualistic cleansing before being bled into small cups, sometimes willingly, often not. This blood was used in multiple ways. One was the menstrual elixir of eternal harmony, a tonic mixed with crushed jade saffron and honey reserved for the emperor and his closest advisors. Another was the soul mask, a facial cosmetic smeared onto the skin to imbue it with vitality. Noblewomen would apply it at night, letting it dry into a crust that supposedly bound the soul to the flesh, delaying aging and warding off bad spirits. The ingredients were sacred, but the rituals were grotesque. In some Taoist circles, men were encouraged to sleep with virgins during their first cycle, believing that absorbing menstrual energy through intercourse would grant them supernatural strength. The girls were told they were serving the empire, that their pain was holy, that their bodies belonged to the divine order. But behind the spiritual language was trauma bleeding and silence. Ritual bleeding became an enforced custom. Girls were made to bleed onto silk cloths, embroidered with cranes or phoenixes, which were then burned in offerings. The ashes were mixed into cosmetic balms or stored in carved jade boxes. Some women were forced to bleed during full moons only timed to court rituals, as if their cycles were nothing more than tools in a bureaucratic calendar. The psychological toll was immense. These girls, some as young as 10, were not allowed to speak of their role. They were cloistered, watched, whispered about. Their rooms were lined with incense and prayer scrolls, as if that would erase the sense of violation. Some wrote secret notes on the backs of cosmetic mirrors, hiding their grief in poems scratched with hairpins. One preserved poem found centuries later inside a lacquered box reads, "My blood is not wine, yet they toast with it. My pain is not incense, yet they burn it. My name is not remembered, but they call me beautiful." Beyond the palaces, similar beliefs seeped into noble homes. Some mothers saved their daughters' first blood to mix into bridal perfumes. Others believed menstrual blood could cure skin ailments, infertility, or even heartbreak. The irony was cruel. The very thing women were shamed for bleeding was at the same time exalted and stolen. And still menstruation carried stigma. Girls were labeled unclean during their cycles. Forbidden to cook, to touch religious objects, even to sleep in the same bed as their husbands. So they bled in private, in shame, until the day came when their blood was suddenly wanted by priests, emperors, or physicians. There was even a darker practice whispered of in remote provinces, the blooding chamber where young girls were isolated during puberty. There, old women tended them with strict rituals, binding their breasts, feeding them powdered lotus root, forcing them to lie on stone beds until the blood came. The first cycle was celebrated not with joy, but with fear. It marked their transition into something more valuable, more vulnerable. Imagine for a moment being a girl taught to fear her own body until the moment it became useful. Not to her, to others. Her bleeding was no longer hers. It belonged to the emperor, to medicine, to the myth of eternal youth. These weren't fringe beliefs. These were encoded in beauty manuals whispered through dynasties and practiced behind locked doors. Because in ancient China, even a woman's pain could be repackaged as luxury. Even her bleeding could be called art. But what happens when a woman's entire body, face, feet, blood breath becomes nothing but a canvas for other people's desires? When beauty is so toxic, so dehumanizing that some women begin to destroy themselves. Just to gain control. She stood before the mirror, hands, trembling knife clutched tight. Her face, once praised, envied, adorned, was too beautiful, too noticed, too dangerous. In the silence of her chamber, she whispered a prayer and dragged the blade across her cheek. Blood welled instantly vivid against her powdered skin. She would scar herself before anyone else could destroy her. Before she was dragged back to the emperor's bed. Before envy took her life. In the great palaces and behind the lacquered doors of noble estates, beauty was not only a means to survival, it was a burden, a trap, and sometimes a death sentence. The deeper a woman fell into the expectations of courtly perfection, the more she lost control of her body, her sanity, her very self. And some in acts of quiet desperation chose to mar the very thing that brought them misery. It began with whispers. A concubine too lovely. A maid whose eyes lingered too long on a prince. A wife whose beauty surpassed her mother-in-law's. In a world where the favor of one man could decide a woman's fate, envy wasn't just bitter, it was lethal. There are chilling stories barely preserved in dusty scrolls of women who disfigured themselves on purpose to escape the dangers of beauty. Some poured boiling water over their own faces. Others cut off their eyebrows or gouged their skin with hairpins. These weren't acts of madness. They were desperate survival tactics. A disfigured woman could be dismissed from court, yes, but at least she might live. One tale tells of a servant girl named Yun, rumored to possess the skin of snow and a voice like silk. The emperor summoned her. Fearing the jealousy of the empress and her rivals, Yun bit through her own lip and scratched her cheeks raw before she could be presented. She was cast out for impurity, left to beg in the streets. But she lived. Her beauty had almost killed her. Her scars saved her. Others took the opposite path, deliberate suffering to gain power. In a strange reversal, some women began performing ritual self-mutilation, not to hide their beauty, but to enhance their desirability through tragedy. A concubine with a tragic story, scarred, limping, weakened, might be seen as more pitiful, more poetic, more worthy of sympathy. The most infamous example was Consort Pan, a favorite of a minor Qing prince. She was struck in the face by a jealous rival and left with a long scar across her jaw. Instead of hiding it, she highlighted it with rouge, framing it as a symbol of loyalty and sorrow. The prince, moved by her endurance, elevated her status. Soon, other concubines began to feign injury or inflict real harm to win similar attention. The court grew quiet, tense. No one knew if the next smile hid poison or pain. But these were only the visible scars. The psychological torment of living inside an ornamental prison was far more insidious. Girls raised to believe their worth began and ended with their appearance suffered profound emotional damage. From childhood, they were taught to eat less, speak softly, and never express needs. Many developed body dysmorphia, though no one called it that. They stared into polished bronze mirrors, convinced their foreheads were too wide, their lips too dull, their skin too flawed. Some began fasting not out of discipline but despair. A noblewoman in the Ming court reportedly survived on nothing but lotus tea for 4 years. She was praised for her discipline. She died of organ failure at 22. Sleep was no escape. In some households, girls were taught to sleep upright so their faces wouldn't wrinkle. Others wore iron masks to train their features overnight. Any sign of aging crow's feet, sagging skin, even faint freckles could ruin a marriage prospect or cause a concubine to be demoted. The consequences of losing beauty were often devastating. A favored consort who fell out of grace might be relocated to a remote corner of the palace, forbidden from speaking to anyone but servants. Some were driven mad by isolation. Others took their own lives, smothered in silk or drowned in garden ponds where they once posed for painted scrolls. And still, even in their despair, they were expected to maintain appearances. There are recorded rituals where concubines would apply makeup before attempting suicide, ensuring they died looking beautiful. Their corpses, carefully arranged by handmaidens, would be powdered and dressed before being presented to palace officials, because even in death, a woman's face spoke for her. Mirror superstition also emerged, reflecting deeper anxieties. In certain chambers, especially in the imperial harem, mirrors were forbidden at night. It was believed that a woman's reflection could trap her soul while she slept. Or worse, that she might see her true self, her suffering, and never recover. One haunting superstition claimed that women who stared too long into mirrors would go mad. That the mirror didn't show the face you wore, but the pain you couldn't hide. Some women covered mirrors with silk. Others smashed them. Still others, in secret moments of rebellion, spoke to them, confessing sins, whispering truths no one else would listen to. What's left then of a woman carved by other people's desires? A body altered, poisoned, starved. A mind fractured by silence. A soul desperate to be seen, even if only by a mirror that doesn't answer back. By now you might think this was the end of the pain, that in death at least a woman would be free. But no. Even the corpse in ancient China had one final role to play to be beautiful. She lay still beneath a sheet of red silk, her face a frozen mask of grace. Servants moved silently around her, brushing crushed pearl powder onto her cheeks, painting her lips a soft cinnabar red, and lining her eyes with black coal. Her limbs, already stiff, were bent gently to recreate the lotus pose, her bound feet wrapped tightly in embroidered shoes. She was dead, but she had to look divine. In ancient China, the pursuit of beauty didn't end with life. In fact, it reached its most macabre peak in death. Women, especially those of the upper classes, were expected to die as they had lived elegant, presentable, untouched by decay. Even in the afterlife, a woman's appearance was scrutinized, stylized, and controlled. The process of preparing a deceased woman for burial was elaborate, ceremonial, and often deeply disturbing. It was believed that a corpse could carry shame into the afterlife if not properly adorned. So the dead were painted, powdered, perfumed. sometimes more lavishly than they had been in life. The first step was the washing of the body, not just for cleanliness, but symbolic purification. Water was infused with flower petals, rice wine, and camphor. The body was shaved, scrubbed, and bleached if necessary. Special attention was paid to the face and hands as they were considered the most visible in the afterlife. If the skin had bruised or begun to turn white, powder mixed with pearl dust was used to conceal it. Then came the application of cosmetics. The cheeks were reddened to mimic vitality. The lips were painted red, often using the same cinnabar that had poisoned the woman in life. The eyes were lined and sometimes left partially open, a sign that the spirit remained alert and aware. Even the nostrils and ears were stuffed with fragrant herbs, not for preservation, but to ward off evil spirits who might smell imperfection. Hair was oiled, styled, and pinned with jade combs. A corpse might wear her finest silk gown or even the wedding robes she had once been denied. Jewelry, gold earrings, silver hairpins, jade bracelets was added not for wealth, but to signal her status among the dead. She had to arrive looking like she belonged. In more extreme cases, posthumous facial reconstruction was attempted. If a woman had died by suicide injury or disease that marred her features, palace morticians would try to reconstruct her face using wax, rice paste, and fabric. There are reports of lotus-bound feet being rewrapped and rebroken after death if they had begun to unfurl from rigor mortis. In one recorded case, a noblewoman's feet were sewn tightly into embroidered shoes and tied with silk thread to preserve the ideal shape for eternity. These weren't rare practices. They were expected especially for concubines' wives and court women. Their beauty had been their value in life. Why should it end in death? In fact, some believed a woman's ghost would become vengeful if she was buried unattractive or unprepared. There are entire folk traditions about ugly ghosts, restless female spirits with unpainted faces and tangled hair cursing the descendants who sent them to the afterlife in shame. To prevent this, families buried women with cosmetic kits, mirrors, powders, rouge, eyebrow brushes as funerary goods. It was said that a woman might wish to freshen her appearance in the spirit realm. Others were buried with their last beauty scroll, a personalized guide that outlined their exact makeup routine. Heaven apparently had standards. One aristocratic burial discovered in modern times revealed a body wrapped in 10 layers of silk, the face still faintly tinted with rouge. Between her fingers was a jade mirror. Tucked into her sleeve was a folded note believed to be a list of beauty instructions for the next world. But even death could be political. In cases where women had fallen out of favor or died disgracefully, they were intentionally buried without makeup. Their faces left raw, their hair uncombed, their jewelry withheld. This was called sending her away in silence, a form of posthumous punishment. These women were believed to wander the afterlife, unrecognized, unremembered, and unloved. And what of the ordinary women, the ones whose beauty was never recorded in scrolls, whose rituals weren't conducted by palace handmaidens? Even they were often prepared by their families with rouge, perfume, and clean robes. Even the poorest households tried to give their daughters one last touch of grace. The obsession ran that deep. In ancient Chinese funerary culture, the dead did not escape the living's expectations. A woman was never just a soul passing on, she was a symbol, a message, a legacy. Her body, even in decay, had to inspire longing, reverence, envy. But beneath the layers of silk, beneath the powder and rouge, was still a corpse. Still skin collapsing inward. Still bones remembering the years of binding, bruising, bleaching. So we are left with a question. If a woman is made beautiful through pain, if her body is broken to be praised, if she must wear a mask even into the grave, was she ever truly seen? And centuries later, we must ask ourselves, how far have we really come? When women still starve for waistlines, bleach their skin, inject their faces, pluck, slice, and filter themselves into unreality? Are we so different? Maybe the jade comb has been replaced by a ring light, the cinnabar by a digital blush. But the hunger, the desperate, bleeding hunger to be beautiful at any cost, still echoes. Because the lie survives longer than the body. And beauty, once it becomes a cage, doesn't vanish with time. It haunts us. It always will.